some context first. This story took place in 2020 when I was 18 years old. I lived in a relatively safe neighborhood, but my country does have a high crime rate in general, so take that with a pinch of salt. My dad had passed away earlier in the year, and I have no siblings either, so my mom and I lived all alone in our house. The COVID lockdowns were still in place, but as certain restrictions were lifted, people were starting to return to work. Between my house and the train tracks was a big stretch of empty field. It became a safe, quiet space for me to escape to whenever I needed to get out of the house for a while. I would normally sit there once a day for a cigarette or two, sometimes having my own little picnic. My home situation was complicated to say the least, and due to the pandemic, I had nowhere else to go. On this particular day, I went there for a few minutes to smoke as I always did. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I noticed a young man walking along the train tracks on the other side of the field. He was barefoot and wearing dirty, worn-out clothes. The man noticed me and made a hand gesture suggesting he was asking for a smoke. I should have just left, but as a teenager, I found it quite difficult to say no to people. I walked a bit towards him and offered him a smoke. He took it from me, but immediately I felt uneasy about the way he was looking at me. The man asked me, "Don't you live in that house right over there?" He pointed right at my exact address. I avoided answering his question, and at this point I realized I needed to leave right now. I had left from my front gate that day. For him to know where I lived, he must have watched me leave from the back gate before. I told him I needed to get going. He started insisting on giving me a hug to say thank you though. I declined several times, and at this point I started backing away quickly. I didn't get very far though. The man easily caught up to me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I panicked, not knowing what to do. All I could think of was that I needed to get away from this man. As I tried to start running from his grip, he grabbed me harder from behind and started dragging me towards the row of houses where the view of the road was completely blocked off. The fences were high too, so no one could see that area from their backyards. We were completely isolated. I was kicking and struggling, desperate to get out of his grasp. He ended up throwing me against the ground, with him jumping on top of me, still holding on. In a split second, my life flashed before my eyes. That feeling that something terrible was about to happen came over me. I couldn't escape. This man was too strong. My arms were trapped by his, and he was holding me down so I couldn't kick him. I did the only thing left to do. I started screaming desperately for help. Suddenly, I was free. I could move again. He had let go and jumped off of me. He ran away so fast I could barely even register it. My heart was pounding furiously. I was shaking in shock from what had just happened. He disappeared into the industrial area on the other side of the train tracks. I immediately ran towards the road. As I reached it, I noticed it was empty. There were no cars parked in my neighbor's driveways either. No one heard me screaming, and had he realized that day would have had a far worse ending for me. He clearly knew where I lived, and I was terrified of him returning. For months after, I had panic attacks and nightmares, and I could barely leave my house without breaking down. I moved away from there a year later, but I still sometimes get scared when I'm home alone or when I have to walk around town. This happened a few years ago when I was about 13. My best friend and I were at a lake in the middle of Georgia, trying to fight the almost 125-degree Fahrenheit weather. We decided to swim to our secret spot. It was really just a sort of cave made out of fallen tree roots. We did the routine snake check and swam in, climbing onto a rock to get inside. We started talking and gossiping, and all was normal until about 45 minutes later. We heard a truck pulling up and the sound of someone getting out. We guessed it was some people going fishing, since the lake was full of bass and other big fish. We started whispering, hoping the person wouldn't find our hiding spot. We heard the splash of someone getting into the water. We brushed it off again until we saw a man about 50 to 60 years old swimming over to our spot. We both looked at each other but didn't move, frozen with fear. He came closer and started treading water about 3 feet away from the edge of our rock. He asked us our names, and we both replied with fake ones. We weren't entirely stupid. He told us they were pretty names, and then in the creepiest voice I ever heard, he looked us both up and down and whispered, "We have some very beautiful young ladies here. Someone like me could easily take advantage of you." He climbed up onto the rock. We then saw he was completely naked. We screamed as he lunged at us. We both dove away into the water. He managed to grab a hold of my friend's bikini top and ripped it off as she dived in. We were both fairly fast swimmers, and we hightailed it back to my friend's mom and explained what happened. While we were in the middle of explaining, the man swam up and started to walk towards us. That was until he saw my friend's mom was there. He quickly ran off into the bushes. His truck drove by a few minutes later, but we couldn't get the tag numbers because he was going so quickly. We called the cops, but from what I've heard, he was not caught. I haven't heard anything else about it since. I moved across the country, but this experience will likely never leave my mind. The most sickening feeling I ever got came from knowing the man must have been watching my house, waiting to see when I would come out and go for my daily jog just before dusk. I wondered how many days he must have been watching to know the house would be empty and that time window he used to break into my home would be optimal, just a 20-minute sliver of time. Once I arrived home that day, it took me a few minutes to even figure out what had happened. When I got home, my heart was already pounding, and my body was covered in cool sweat. My mind was racing before I even saw the broken window in my laundry room. It was tucked in the far corner of the house, a floor-level window, the perfect entry point. I wondered if whoever this intruder was had already cased my house a couple of times. Maybe when I was still home or even asleep in the middle of the night even. I couldn't think of a reason why they thought my house was a particularly attractive target. I have almost nothing of value, and I'm a very modest person. What happened was a burglar had broken into my home, stolen some of my fake jewelry, an old bottle of antibiotics, and a broken iPhone. All in all, the value of everything taken was probably just under $100 tops. What they had accomplished, though, was shattering my trust in the world more than anything else. As they say, the best things in life are free. After realizing what happened, I gave the rest of the house a quick look over as I talked to the 911 dispatcher and had him relay the cops towards my home. I waited out front for them to arrive. Law enforcement didn't exactly present me with any revelations I didn't already know. Someone broke in, stole some items, and ran out, all in the span of just a few minutes while I was out on my jog. They were going to keep eyes out and ears open for anything suspicious, but that's about all they could do. At the moment, at least a couple of them were nice enough to stick around and board up the broken window for me. They also recommended some cheaper but non-sketchy motels I could check into for a while if I didn't want to stay in the house for a couple of nights. Most kindly, one of the officers even offered to help me set up a video security system he had but didn't need anymore. He said it could be installed in 20 minutes. It was basically just a glorified baby monitor, but it was great to keep an eye on your place if you weren't there. Just place it next to the big floor-level window to scare off anyone sizing up the place. He ran home and brought it back and hooked it up in my house, while some other officers helped me patch up the window. I thanked them for being so kind to me and turned down the motel idea. My boyfriend Jacob would be over in an hour or two anyway, and that was enough to make me comfortable enough to stay in the home that night. I knew it was probably just some desperate tweaker willing to bust in for $100 worth of stuff, and likely they would not come back again. The police confirmed that they thought so as well. I just asked if one of them could park out front until my boyfriend got home. They agreed, and Jacob arrived around 9 p.m. The night moved on, and I told him all the details. He didn't seem to be particularly concerned. He agreed with my initial assessment, although he did keep his hunting shotgun right next to my bed, just in case the person decided to come back. It wasn't easy, but I was eventually able to fall asleep. I got a few hours of the sweet embrace of slumber before the quick sound of a text message coming to my phone shook me awake. I groaned and walked to the bathroom to relieve myself. I forgot about the text by the time I got back to bed, and I didn't check it. I wish I had checked that message, though. I checked the message first thing in the morning. It was from my mom. I had avoided telling her what happened because I knew she would freak out and drive all the way from Sacramento in the middle of the night just to comfort me. All that would do was make me more freaked out. Apparently, Jacob had posted a photo of his shotgun resting next to the bed with a little bit of a story to it. My mom saw this on social media and started texting me at 1 a.m. Her first text was actually very helpful and something Jacob and I should have thought about the night before. I saw Jacob's post about what happened. I'm sorry that happened to you. Did you make sure the police checked every inch of your house to make sure the guy isn't still there? My mom actually had a great point. I never asked the cops just how much they'd scoured the house. They just said he'd ran off sometime before I got home, and that was it. Jacob and I had not really done a thorough job of checking either. I woke up Jacob and told him we needed to search everywhere in the house. He was tired and unhappy, but agreed to do it with a shotgun in hand. What we found underneath my bathroom sink horrified me. There was a large cabinet directly underneath the sink in the bathroom of my bedroom, about the size of a washing machine. I had never really thought about it until now. I didn't use it normally either. I casually pulled the cabinet open, almost as an afterthought. It was immediately overtaken by the hideous scent of male BO. I started coughing as I looked away, and my eyes connected with Jacob, who had a look of alarm on his face I had never seen before. I followed Jacob's eyes and the stench to the space below the sink, where I saw a filthy jean jacket and what looked like human excrement. There were also the bottles of pills which had been missing. We called the cops and had the house 100% searched. Nothing turned up, but the cop who gave me the video system pointed out we should review the footage to see if anything happened during the night. Jacob and I watched the footage on my laptop with a few cops hanging over our shoulders. I was almost frozen in fear, despite the sheer amount of armed men in the room whose job it was to protect me. We had set up the cameras in 3 different areas, so we had 3 different shots we could watch of what happened. One in my bathroom, one in my bedroom, and one in the living room which fed out into the front driveway of the house. As we watched the footage, it started with the camera set up in my bedroom. The angle the camera provided showed my bedroom through the open door. A timestamp said it was just after 3 a.m. when movement finally started to happen. Jacob and I were sleeping in our bed, and we watched in horror as the dark figure of a man stretched himself out from underneath the bathroom sink in the other camera. He took a moment to steady himself in the bathroom before he slowly walked into our bedroom. He walked right up to my bed where Jacob and I were sleeping. He just stopped at the foot of our bed and stood there for a good 20 seconds, staring at us as we slept. He then walked out of the bedroom door. We watched the intruder simply walk out the front door at that point. He even somehow locked the front door on his way out. The whole thing had a strange feeling of politeness to it, but it was in no way friendly. It would have been much better had the intruder rifled through all my stuff or stolen all my things. Heck, it might have been better if he'd attacked me hiding under the sink where I had brushed my teeth and washed my face just a few hours before, than walking away and disappearing. That was the worst thing he could have possibly done. This felt so much more personal than opportunistic, like maybe this was all planned. I never stayed another night in that house. I moved a couple of towns over into a secure apartment building with heavy security. Still though, I could never sleep easy at night, even if Jacob and his shotgun were by my side. I've done my best to fight through it. My new apartment had a little compartment beneath the sink as well, and when I moved in my first night in the new apartment, I had Jacob come over with tools from work and take that hinge off. I feel a certain comfort each night when I'm able to kick my feet into that open space while I brush my teeth. It does just a little bit to calm my nerves, but it will never be quite the same again. I remember it was a Friday. I woke up early in the morning to get up for work. I dragged myself out of bed and into the kitchen to make my coffee. I took very light steps into my daughter's bedroom and gave her a kiss on the head, trying not to wake her up. I then tiptoed back to the kitchen and grabbed my coffee. "Good morning," I heard my daughter call out from behind me. I turned around and replied, "Good morning, sunshine." I told her to go grab her stuff and get ready for school. She walked back to her room and I heard silence for a while. I walked in and saw her asleep in her bed. I woke her up and tried to keep her awake. I asked her why she was so tired. Her reply was the most bone-chilling thing I'd ever heard. Let me remind you that she was only 8 years old. "Well, there's this really scary guy who visits me at night." That was already weird enough, so I asked her to elaborate further. "You mean in your dreams?" She told me, "No, Daddy, when I'm awake he comes out and tells me scary stories. They really keep me up." She started trying to look around me, like she was trying to look into her closet or something. I got up to go check out the closet, and of course there was nothing there but clothes. I made sure to tell her that if this person ever came back again to let me know. "But Dad, I shouldn't have told you at all. He said if I told anyone he'd hurt me." I replied, "No one will hurt you as long as I'm here, okay?" After that, I took her to school. I went to work, and at work, my boss and I were having a conversation. I ended up telling him about the closet creature. He laughed and told me it was just her imagination probably. His kids had had their own phase about this sort of thing. I laughed too, but honestly, I was a bit weirded out about it. After work, I picked up my daughter, and we went home. I made us some dinner and asked her with curiosity to draw this thing in her closet. She did so. It only had a little bit of hair, a white face, and a pointy nose that was black around his eyes, and what appeared to be blood on his clothes or something. Even as a grown man, this scared me a bit. What the hell was happening to make my daughter dream about such disturbing things? I tried not to show how unsettled I was, though. I wanted to know for sure if this was actually a dream, or if she was seeing something in real life that was making her think about this. That night, I peeked into her room every 30 minutes or so. It must have been 1 in the morning, and I was still up. I had work the next day, but I couldn't go to bed without knowing, because either way, my daughter had a problem, and I needed to help her with it. To do that, though, I needed to know what was happening in the first place. I waited until she went to bed and peeked into her room every 30 minutes like I said, to see what was going on. She was pretty quiet. She lay on her bed and most of the time was perfectly asleep. After 30 minutes passed by, I walked into her room again. I peeked around the corner. She was laying in her bed asleep. Before I went back to waiting for a little while longer though, I looked up to the window next to her bed and I couldn't breathe. Similar to her drawing, but of course a bit different, there was what appeared to be a man in a clown getup tapping at her window. It looked like he was mouthing something to her. something like, "Hey, wake up!" At this point, I was outraged. I wasn't even thinking really. I ran over to the window. The clown saw me before I actually reached him and took off running. I realized I should have gone out the front door and snuck up on this freak, but it was already too late. "Daddy, what's happening?" My daughter was awake now and very confused. I told her to stay put as I jumped out her window. Outside, I saw the guy running down the road as fast as he could. He was really taking off. Immediately, I called the police and filed a report. I wasn't going to be able to catch up with him with that much of a head start. It's been several weeks now, but they never found anyone matching the description. It scares the hell out of me, knowing this freak is still out there, and he knows where we live as well. Later that night, or should I say that morning, I sat my daughter down and gave it to her straight. I drilled into her head that she's not supposed to talk to strangers, to anyone she doesn't know, and to keep her window shut and locked no matter what. I wasn't that confident in those measures though, so I ended up boarding up that window anyway. No one would be getting in or out. For the longest time, my daughter always slept in my bed. Jesus, that was the most awful experience. It scares me knowing what kind of perverts and freaks are out there. I try not to think about what could have happened had he ever gotten inside. What about the part of him being in the closet though? I asked my daughter about it and she said he used to sneak in and sleep in there. At the time this happened, I was 14, and weirdly enough, I was going to the circus that was in town. If I remember correctly, the place was called the Clown's Nest or something. It had quite a weird name, I know, but I was going and I was pretty excited. I bought my ticket and some popcorn and went in and took a seat. The backstage door opened slightly. And inside I could see what looked like a man in his early 40s with green dyed hair. I sat back and relaxed, waiting for the show to start. There were 3 other clowns, 2 men and a woman. The woman was real skinny, and one of the men was really tall and muscular. The second guy and third clown was the one I had seen backstage just a few moments ago. He had green hair and red lipstick with white makeup, but had black eyes which must have been contact lenses. The clowns ran around throwing flowers to the audience down below. A man with black spandex covering his body ran and climbed a pole and jumped on a trampoline doing some tricks. I noticed that the older man clown was staring at one particular area in the audience. The show went on for a while longer when I heard a raspy voice to my left. A few minutes ago, a man and his daughter had sat down right next to me, and recently that man had gotten up to go to the bathroom, or go to the concession stand, I guess. I'm not sure which. I decided to listen in since something weird was going on here just from the vibe I was getting. The voice asked this little girl, "Hey kiddo, you want to go backstage?" The whole situation sounded freaky. When I heard this though, I turned to my left immediately. There was that clown very creepily standing next to the girl. Better yet, the girl actually said yes. The clown then said this to her, "I shit you not. No worries, you get some special perks cause I'm your dad's friend." They stood up and started to walk off. Being both weirded out and very worried, I decided to follow behind them. I couldn't help but think this guy must be a freak. Before they actually made it backstage, I couldn't bear this any longer. I ran over and grabbed the girl's hand. They both looked surprised and stared over at me. I told her I'd buy her and her dad some popcorn if she came back to her seat quietly, and I'd give her some candy as well. She said okay, while the clown made a very angry face and stomped away. I don't really know what he had been planning, but I couldn't help but feel furious at this guy anyway. Like I had promised, I took the girl back to her seat, bought her and her dad popcorn, and gave her some candy I had. I explained to her dad what happened, and he thanked me. We actually ended up walking home together. As we talked, he wanted to thank me once more for what I did and said he'd be sure not to leave his daughter alone again like that. They both walked inside their house and I began my own walk home. It turned out my place was only a couple of blocks down anyway. I couldn't help but notice though that behind me was a man in a hood that had been following us for quite a while. I didn't want to be a jerk and immediately assumed the guy was a creeper, but after making so many turns and following us for so long, he was still following me. As I continued walking, when I finally turned onto my own sidewalk, I turned around abruptly and asked the man if I could help him with something. I then heard that same raspy voice from before. No, I was just looking around. I told him okay, but he should probably be getting home now. It was about midnight around this time. He then replied that he thought my house was for sale and he wanted to go visit it. I told him it was not for sale, and I told him so long. I told him I had some buddies waiting on me. When I turned around though, I heard him say there were no friends waiting on me. This kind of freaked me out, because I had been lying to make sure he knew there were other people not so far away. I didn't reply this time. I just kept walking and went inside. I immediately looked out the window to see this guy just standing there for the longest time. I was nervous to call the cops because I'd never done that before, but I was getting pretty scared. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, staring at this guy. He was just on the sidewalk looking toward the house. He didn't move a single inch. Eventually, the freak blew a kiss at me and walked away. The next day, I told my parents what happened. I think they believed me, but they found the story quite funny, which kind of irritated me. To this day, I don't trust any clowns. If I had a moral to the story, it'd be to always look after your kids. It only takes a few seconds for a strange old man to take them, and you never know who that old man could be. I was always left with a lot of responsibility when I was a kid. I was the oldest of 4 children, and even from a really young age, I had to be responsible for all of my siblings. I was babysitting them when I was young enough to need a babysitter myself. However, my parents always insisted I knew better, and that I had to be responsible for all the other children, basically whenever they didn't want to be. We lived in an old house out in the hills for my entire childhood. We had 1 car, which we had for years and years that I remember. It was old and probably not the best vehicle to be driving around in bad weather. That meant if my parents were out, they wouldn't always come home if the weather was too bad. It wasn't unusual that I would be home alone with the other kids overnight, and sometimes even longer. This happened one winter when I was about 12 years old. My parents had gone over to some relative's house to hang out, drink, and do that sort of thing. I can't recall who it was, but that's not the part of the story that matters. This was the sort of thing that the adults in my family did every weekend before driving home, likely very drunk. I was at home with the other kids, and I had to prepare dinner for them and keep them all entertained. Luckily, it was a Friday night, so I didn't have to worry about getting them in bed too early. The kids all liked staying up late on a Friday night and watching some Johnny Carson before bedtime. My parents weren't home when the school bus dropped us off. There was a note on the fridge to contact the Meeks family down the street if anything were to happen. They were a bit of a ways up the hill from us though, so we really didn't ever contact them for any reason. As I mentioned before, I was supposed to know better, and thus be able to take care of all the others no matter what happened. It began snowing not long after we got home. It seemed light at first, and like it might not stick, but I was sure wrong about that. The snow began falling pretty heavily, and it definitely was sticking. It began to pile up pretty quickly. It wasn't long until I got the call from the parents, letting us know they would be staying the night over at the relative's house. They had been drinking too much, and it would be even more dangerous than usual to drive up. No big deal. I was expecting this to happen anyway. I put the 2 younger children to bed after Johnny Carson and let my 10-year-old brother stay up with me. Honestly, I didn't want to be up by myself, and he and I always got along very well. I don't know if this is just in retrospect due to what else happened that night, but I recall this really creepy feeling that I couldn't identify for some reason. It made me feel much safer to have someone else up with me. I kept on getting up and checking the weather. The front window looked out onto the yard, but it was hard to see much looking out there right now. We had a light on the front porch, which we always had to leave on when we were home alone, but the snow was so thick that we couldn't see anything out there. It was way too thick. It was pretty late, and my brother and I were up later than we usually would have tried to stay awake. There were some Christmas specials on TV, and although the reception wasn't so good, it wasn't something we noticed back then. All TV that far out in the country got some real fuzzy reception. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we heard this loud crashing noise. The couch we were sitting on was up against the same wall as the window. We had to turn around in order to see that the window had just been busted open. The scariest part, though, was that we noticed an arm coming through the broken open window. That terrified us both, and we jumped off the couch in a hurry. My little brother jumped and ran out of the room faster than I could have imagined. I don't blame him, though. I was 12 years old and terrified. I could only imagine how scared a 10-year-old would be. He was also much faster than I was at getting out of that room. I got off the couch and looked back at the window, wondering what it was that I was supposed to do. I saw a guy I didn't recognize looking in. He saw me standing there and looked surprised to see me. Looking back, I think he may have thought no one was home because of there being no vehicle in the driveway. It didn't make sense he would be trying to rob this house out in the middle of nowhere, though. At least it didn't make much sense to me at the time. If he were a robber, I guess it's possible he thought it would take much longer for the police to arrive. My little brother ran into the room with my dad's rifle, surprising me because I thought he wasn't going to come back. We were all taught to shoot at a very young age, so I guess I can understand why he went after the gun. I thought he would be found hiding under the bed or in the closet. The guy standing in the window saw that gun and immediately retreated backward. I ran over to the door and looked out through it. Although it was hard to see what was happening due to the falling snow, I could see the man retreating into it. It only took a few moments, though, before he was completely lost in the torrent of falling snow. We did our best to cover up the window, but we were mostly just worried about whether the man was going to come back and try another entrance or something. My brother and I went around to make sure the doors and windows were all locked. Then we sat together on the couch in fear of that guy coming back. We kept the rifle right by us, and eventually both fell asleep on the couch together. The guy never did come back. The following morning, the snow was higher than I'd ever seen before. There was no way our parents would be able to get back that day. In fact, it took them many days before they were able to. Fortunately, we didn't have any further problems during that time. In college, I was stupid. Yeah, there's a phrase you've probably heard a million times over. But I wasn't just the, "Oh, I'm skipping class today and deliberately shirking homework for no other reason than to party" kind of stupid. I made decisions that actively could have endangered my life for the sake of being cool, especially in my freshman and sophomore years. I did eventually get it straight by my senior year, but I digress. I probably shouldn't even be here to tell some of these stories. However, there was one decision I made that I can't even just call stupid. It was so life-threatening, so idiotic, so no common sense based that I probably should have just called it quits the moment I made it. Honestly, I still don't know how I got out of it as well as I did. Anyway, here's the lead up to the event. My a cappella group, yes, I was the freshman in an a cappella group wanting to be like the girls in Pitch Perfect, had organized a celebratory dinner at a local pub known as The Roost. It seemed really sketchy at first. It was located in the basement of an apartment building, but once you opened the door to the pub itself, it instantly became a legitimate establishment. We had a really fun night, sharing a huge table of appetizers and a rum bucket each. They were offering a $5 special, you see. We were telling each other stories and even occasionally bursting into song. The more I drank, the more blurry the night became. Faces started swimming together, and I really didn't want the night to end. The alcohol was definitely lowering my inhibitions considerably, but like any alcohol drinker, I thought I was still in control. At the end of the night, most of my group split off to go home. That meant I was left all alone to walk to my apartment all the way across town. Now, I should say that one of my friends in the group offered to go home with me, but I refused because I thought it was too far for them, and I thought I would be fine. In hindsight, I think I should have taken their offer. It was around 10 p.m. when I started this lonely journey home. I could see my breath in the night's air. All the alcohol in my system was making me feel quite warm, though. I remember feeling grateful for it as I meandered my way down the sidewalk, stumbling here and there. Thankfully, the route to my apartment was pretty well lit and populated, so I didn't think I had much to worry about. At worst, I'd trip and smash my nose in, which due to how drunk I was a real possibility. I was just settling into daydreaming when a car pulled up right beside me. I got startled and stepped back, almost teetering over. From what I remember, a guy my age leaned out the driver's side window. "Hey there, you want to have some fun? My buddies and I were going to play some games at my friend's house." This would be the moment for everyone to shout, "No, don't go in there!" at the top of their lungs during a horror movie. But I was so drunk there were no alarm bells at all. No voice in my head shouting at me not to do it or calling me an idiot. So, with a huge grin, I said, "Hell yeah!" Like I said, I wanted the fun to continue, and this guy was pretty cute. I got into the car. I sat shotgun, and then I noticed another 3 guys sat in the back. The driver, who said his name was Charlie, kept up conversation with me about nothing and everything at the same time. My favorite games, movies, alcohol. He said he wanted to have something everyone would like at their little party. The way he smiled at me made me blush, and despite the unusual way we were meeting, my addled brain told me, fuck it, if tonight goes well, I want to see this guy again. Of course, on the way there, I started to sober up a little. I realized that this Charlie guy had never told me which friend was supposedly hosting, nor where we would actually be going for that matter. The road seemed to stretch endlessly for miles, and I began to shiver. Charlie asked me if I was cold, and motioned to turn the heat up. I said thanks and then asked him where we were all going. "We're going to my friend's place. Relax," he said, laughing. "Yeah, but where is your friend's place?" I pressed on. "Oh, it's not far, just a few more minutes. Hey, so you said you did a cappella, right?" Now I was more quickly beginning to sober up. I was in a car with 4 guys I didn't know. I didn't know where we were or where we were even going. I knew I was pretty fucked now. "Okay, so I'm gonna need some answers or I need to go home." I tried sounding as stern as possible, but my voice came out dry and weak. I cleared my throat and tried a different approach when they didn't respond. "Can we at least stop for some water? Is there a gas station nearby or something?" "Why, you gonna bail on us or something?" One of his friends piped up. I only noticed just now that they were looking at me really intensely, like they were just waiting for something to happen. Something was very wrong here, and I'd waltzed right into it. My rum bucket was threatening to make a reappearance. I was thinking it wouldn't be that bad if I just let it all loose on them. That's when Charlie piped up again. "We're here." The here he was referring to was a 1-story house that looked like it could have been on an average episode of Hoarders, or perhaps even abandoned completely, if it weren't for the light shining out through the windows. trash and bottles littered the ground. I opened the door before the car even stopped and launched myself to the ground. The rocks scraped me as I rolled on it. Charlie shouted something, but I couldn't hear him. The car came to a screeching stop. I scrambled to my feet and took off running. I shook the gravel out of my hair as I tore down the street and ran off into the woods. I had no idea where I was, or even where I was going. I only knew what I was running away from. I could hear footsteps and shouting chasing after me, but I knew I couldn't look back. As I was running, various branches slapped me across the face. I was hoping for something, anything familiar, that wasn't Charlie and these other guys. Eventually, I broke through the tree line, and on the other side, I saw a house. The porch light was on, and I could see someone was inside watching TV through one of the windows. Charlie's shouts were long gone by this point, but I didn't want to take the chance that he'd given up on doing whatever he was trying to do. I ran up and knocked on the door. No one came to answer at first, and I mean, who could blame them really? I kept on knocking though, this time yelling out, "Hey, I need help, please!" Finally, a young couple answered. A dog barked from inside the house, and I breathed a sigh of relief. They looked obviously startled to see me there, dirt-caked and out of breath. They asked me if there was something I needed. I'm not religious, but I was thanking every god in that moment. I explained as quickly as I could that I had been picked up by some guys in a car, and things had started getting really sketchy. I had to call someone right now. They quickly ushered me inside and introduced me to their hound dog, so he'd stop barking. They got me a phone and a hot drink as well. These two were beyond nice to a strange girl coming to their house in the middle of the night. I'll forever look back on them and wish they're doing okay. Anyway, I called one of my a cappella friends who was still fit to drive. She became the voice of reason I'd been looking for this entire time. She really chewed me out for my stupid decisions. She still came out to get me though, and I promised her I'd never do such fucking stupid shit again. Her words, not mine. At the time this took place, I was a 23-year-old female student in my third year of study at the University of Manchester. It was Valentine's weekend of 2016, and just after 6 p.m. on Friday the 12th. I was on my way back home following a long day at uni. It had just started to get dark as I left campus, and after catching the tram all the way down, it was almost pitch black outside. I made a quick stop at the corner shop to pick up some wine for me and my flatmate. I turned off the main road in the direction of my building. It was no more than a few minutes away from home now, when I suddenly spotted someone in front of me. It was just some guy in a waterproof jacket with his hood up, which wasn't really that unusual. It was a bit cold out and it was slightly drizzling at the time. I just kept on walking towards him, feeling only the usual amount of awkwardness when you're about to pass by a stranger on a narrow stretch of pavement. We passed each other by without incident, just as I had expected. I couldn't have made it more than a few feet down the street though, when I heard the man say something which had clearly been directed at me. I hadn't quite caught exactly what he'd said though. It was loud enough for me to hear that he'd turned around to say it though, to me in particular. Out of sheer politeness, I turned around. "I'm sorry? I didn't quite catch that." I didn't know if he was drunk or something, but he repeated himself. I was no closer to understanding him, however. What I did understand, though, is that the way he was looking at me made me feel very uncomfortable, horrible even. I gave him a sort of nothing apology, then kept on walking at a much faster pace. It sounds crazy to type this looking back on it, but when I'd first heard him walking behind me and following me up the street, I wasn't really that scared. I was more angry, really. Maybe if I just kept on walking and ignored him, things would have been completely different, but I gave in to my anger. I turned around in place and very sternly told the man to stop following me. In my experience, most men who act out of line like that just need a good telling off. Generally speaking, if you tell someone X or Y behavior isn't very attractive, they'll at least make some small effort to correct it. Then though, some people are very different. I'm not trying to be rude here either. I know this goes for all types of people, whatever they identify as. But sometimes you just meet a person who just isn't. And by that, I mean they look like a person, walk, talk, and act like a person, but they're not. There's something different about them. When I turned around and sternly told him to stop following me or I'd call the police, I don't quite know what I expected him to do. Actually stopping seemed quite high on my list, potentially followed by some sort of throwaway antagonizing comment. You know, calling me a bad name or something. What I didn't expect him to do, though, was throw a punch so fast I barely had time to react. I don't think he fully knocked me out, but when his fist smashed into my face, I think I was as close as I ever am going to get. 1 second, I remember thinking, oh my god, he's gonna do something. Then the next, I was lying on the pavement and half in the road, with this wanker rummaging through my handbag and taking anything of value. I have a very vivid memory of thinking, you could have just asked me. Obviously, I didn't want to give him my bag, but I was hardly going to fight him if he pulled out a knife or tried to grab it from me. My next thought was I had to run down the street and get to my flat, because, like I said, I was only a few minutes walk away at the very most. I tried to stand, but I felt him kick my legs out from under me. The next time I tried to stand, he took my legs out from under me again. That time, though, it was because he started to drag me along the pavement. I don't know if there was a car waiting or something, and I don't know what was going through that guy's head, but I started screaming for dear life, hoping someone would hear me. Luckily, someone did. Next thing I know, I heard a woman's voice shouting, "Hey, you leave her alone!" I looked up to see that a burglar light had switched on, and standing in the pathway to her home was a woman holding a phone to her ear, probably just having called 999. I remember looking up to see the panic on the man's face, and in his moment of hesitation, I scrambled to my feet and ran down the woman's front path and right into her house before she slammed the door closed behind us. I was in complete shock. My knees felt weak, so I just sort of threw myself down on the stairs in the front hallway. I kept alternating between saying thank you and sorry. I realized that my head was dripping with blood on this nice lady's carpet. She handed me the phone before running off to grab a wet towel. I was still describing my attacker to the dispatcher, dabbing at my bleeding spot with the wet towel, when the nice woman went off to make us both a cup of tea. Seconds later, the door shook with a blow so hard I was amazed it didn't come crashing off the hinges right away. I went into a panic and started shouting that he was trying to break in. I was sort of half yelling into the phone and half to the woman in the kitchen making tea. She came running up the hallway and told me to go upstairs, then directed me into what looked like some sort of office or computer room at the far end of the landing. She slammed the door shut behind us, closed a small sliding lock, and then fished a baseball bat out from some side cabinet. "It's the only room with a lock on the door," I remember her saying, just as there was another crash from downstairs. My husband installed it to keep me out while he's working. I'm quite glad he did. Now, just to be honest, I remember being in total awe of her. She seemed so calm, while I was just beside myself. When she walked over to the window to look out the front of her house, I followed her, and that's when I saw him. The man was walking all the way to the end of this woman's path, and then running all the way back up at top speed before slamming their foot into the door. From the amount of force he was putting into his kicks, I couldn't believe the door was still on its hinges, or that his knees were still intact. Because I was still on the phone with the police, I kept telling them how determined this man was to get in. I remember the dispatcher saying something like, "Since it's an ongoing incident, officers will be with you in just a few minutes." I remember how utterly musical her words sounded in that moment. She wasn't wrong either. Although it felt much longer, the guy was only able to take a few more run-ups before the sound of sirens had him second-guessing himself. Surprisingly enough, though, it didn't stop him at all. He was still trying to kick in the lady's door when the police showed up. They took him down to the ground hard. I cried with relief, seeing him being dragged away into their van. The nice lady, whose name I soon found out was Pauline, was finally able to get us those cups of tea. She ended up making 4 cups, 2 for us and 2 for the 2 police officers who stayed behind to take statements from us. By the time all that side of things was wrapped up, her husband had arrived home to get the shock of his life. It was him that helped me gather up my stuff from outside. Everything except the bottle of wine that had smashed after the first fall. After he was nice enough to help me get my things together, he also gave me a ride home. My flatmate started calling me during the journey home, wondering where I was. I didn't have the heart to tell her what happened over the phone. Instead, I texted her and said I'd be home soon. Not why I'd been late, though. Luckily for me, she'd bought a second one already and was only too happy to run out to buy a replacement when she heard what happened to me. It makes me feel quite emotional to think about just how lucky I was on a number of levels that night. Lucky the punch didn't break my nose or do any permanent damage when I fell. Lucky Pauline was there to rescue me. Lucky that door didn't cave in. I know mine probably would have. With that feeling of fortuitousness, though, comes another much darker kind of feeling. Guilt. I felt guilty I managed to escape that situation when so many others wouldn't get that chance. I sometimes think about what might have happened if Pauline hadn't interfered. It drives me to tears. I donate to a charity called the Survivors Trust. I know it's only a few quid a month, but it's doing my part. Me trying to make a difference. Me trying to make a difference for all the women and girls who didn't have someone to help them like I did. I still keep in touch with Pauline and her husband, and we swap birthday cards and Christmas cards every year. I also send them a little wedding anniversary gift around that date in September, too. I think that's the least I can do for them, because without the kindness, compassion, and bravery they showed that night, I think my life would be very different now. A few months later, I got a phone call from a detective who said he'd dealt with violent crimes. They'd caught the guy who tried to attack me, but by the looks of things, there wasn't going to be any kind of trial, and it was unlikely he was going to prison. He was quick to assure me this didn't mean he'd be back on the streets anytime soon, though. Instead, there had been a psychiatric assessment. The results showed he couldn't be held legally responsible for the assault. In so many words, he was completely off his rocker. He was scheduled to be moved to a secure psychiatric unit, and unless he shows signs of improvement, he'll be kept there indefinitely as far as I know. In fact, I think he's still in there to this day. I'm legally entitled to be informed of his release, and I'm sure if that day ever does come, I'll get a notification right away, but I can't see that happening anytime soon. Let me preface this by saying I work in a well-populated town with a low crime rate, and no reason to outright assume any of these actions were what I later found out to be sex trafficking attempts. I work at a popular coffee chain, generally doing afternoon and closing shifts. This night in particular, we had a very young crew for closing, which happens at 10:30 p.m. For reference, our shift head was 19. We'll call her Sarah. There was myself, 17, my coworker 17, who we'll call Mia, and another coworker 18, who we'll call D. It had been a relatively slow night so far, with only a few loyal regulars dropping by. Both drive-thru and the cafe were empty. Heavy rainfall had started, and no one wanted to be out at this time. I was in the front of the store cleaning, while the rest of my coworkers were in the back. That was when an older man walked in. He wore odd clothing, a bit strange for the humid weather. Full black attire with combat boots, a heavy red jacket, and a beanie on his head obscuring his hair. I brushed it off as protection from the storm and figured he worked outside or something. I went to ask if he had placed an online order as he stood at the mobile counter. Putting on my best customer service voice, I smiled and went through the standard spiel. I was alarmed though when, instead of responding, he placed this bag on the counter and started pulling out DVDs. Once he'd finished pulling out a stack of 10 or so, he stared past me into the back room where my coworkers were obliviously chatting. He then made a lap around the store. He was eyeing me the entire time and not speaking a word. He backed out the front door and walked out to his truck, which I now saw was a large black pickup. Freaked out by his behavior, I stupidly grabbed the stack of DVDs and ran back to my coworkers. They were immediately alarmed by my demeanor and asked me what was wrong. I held the DVDs out and let them inspect them while I explained what happened. Much to my discomfort, Sarah pointed out that all the movies in the stack had synopsises about murders or kidnappings. Slightly pissed off and extremely uncomfortable, we made the decision to call my manager. He picked up and Sarah explained the situation. I comforted Dee and Mia, who were freaked out, probably even more so than me at the time. He told me there was nothing we could do about it but to call back if anything else happened. We hung up and moved back to the front of the store as a group. Things went about as usual from then on. There was an air of fear about us. Mia stuck close to my side, and Dee stuck to Sarah's. The man's truck had pulled off at that point. But much to my dismay, he had pulled into the now-closed grocery store next door, sitting with a clear view through the drive-thru window. A few cars pulled through the drive-thru, and I even had a few customers ask if I was alright, due to my assumedly terrified face. I've always had a pretty good intuition about things, and this felt more wrong than anything else I had ever felt. As more time passed by, it was now time for Dee to leave. The man was still in the parking lot next door. We decided it would be best to call her boyfriend and have him come pick her up. This wasn't an irregular occurrence, and we didn't want this guy following her home. Mia then pointed out that a van had been sitting in the back of the parking lot for more than an hour at this point. We hadn't noticed this previously. Another gut feeling hit, and I made the decision to quickly lock the door. Daniel told her he was on the way, and I informed my manager that we closed the cafe for peace of mind. He said that was fine since business was slow anyway. Now, Sarah and Dee were in the back, and Mia and I were out front. I started cleaning the machines and trying to make idle chatter to keep her calm, which was no small feat, as she jumped every time she heard someone steaming milk even. As we were talking, I had my back turned to her when she suddenly screamed out mid-sentence, "Get out!" Alarmed, I whipped around to see where she was standing. She was standing near the counter close to the drive-thru window. I saw her pointing to a shadowy figure trying to climb in through the window. The next few moments were a blur of adrenaline, rushed thinking, and what I can only explain as extreme divine intervention. Grabbing her arm, I yanked Mia behind me and grabbed the hot bucket of sanitizer I had been using to scrub the counters around the machines. I threw the liquid all over the man's head, simultaneously hitting him in the head with the bucket and pushing him out the window. He only had his shoulders through so far. Now he had a big red bucket stuck on his head. At the same exact time, Daniel pulled up outside. Mia was now yelling for someone to call the police. I could see Dee in my peripherals running outside to Daniel. I slammed the drive-thru window shut and locked them. The man was laying on the ground, struggling to get his bearings. I couldn't tell you how much time had passed, although it couldn't have been more than 15 to 30 seconds. Daniel rushed over to the man who had now gotten to his knees. He kicked him in the back and pinned him on the ground. Sarah and Mia were pulling me to the back of the store, all of us fighting back sobs with Sarah on the phone with the police. Thankfully, some of our regulars happened to be deputies. They arrived within 5 minutes of our call and arrested the man. The aftermath was messy. They eventually pinned him as a member of a local trafficking ring that had been caught years prior and let out. Oh, yeah, and the van in the back that had kept Dee from leaving in the first place? It hightailed it out of the parking lot in the middle of all the action. It was eventually traced back to people who were also a part of the ring. Even though I won't be releasing names or such, as legal proceedings are still happening, I figured I would share my story. I still work there, and I'm very grateful for Daniel, who very well could have saved all our lives in that moment. He managed to keep the man pinned the entire time until the police arrived and disarmed him. The true hero of this story, although I do pride myself on quick thinking for getting him out of the store. Moral of the story, trust your gut feelings and always have a steaming hot bucket of something on hand. When a couple of friends, let's call them Gary and Martha, told me they were going to sell their car on Craigslist for tuition money, I thought it was a bit sketchy at best. I was also in a similar boat though. COVID money had started to run out, and classes were coming up. I tried not to judge. We were all desperate for money to make ends meet, and if selling on a sketchy site famously known for hosting ads by a serial killer floats your boat, you do you. Anyway, I tried really hard not to judge. Lots of people have sold and bought things on Craigslist without any trouble, so I wished them luck, but kept tabs on how the situation was going from time to time. They said they had a few offers, but nothing substantial, either well below their asking price or the buyer was flaky with messages or extremely weird. Nothing too crazy though. That was until they got a message from someone named Chris. Chris said that he was in a real pinch and had been looking for a car before his wife gave birth to their baby. He wasn't having much luck and said he was even willing to pay more than their original asking price. My friends were thrilled and messaged him back right away to set up a time to meet and look over the car. They thought they'd really hit a stroke of good fortune. I was optimistic for them and hoped Chris liked the car. From what I heard, they were going to meet that Friday afternoon, about a week after their first message. Chris would be getting a ride from a friend, and they planned to take the car for a test drive around the block before making any final decisions. My friends thought this sounded reasonable, so they busied themselves with cleaning the car and making it as nice as possible. They told me about the travel courses they could take with the extra money. They'd been eyeing a 2-week cultural course in Costa Rica for quite some time. As far as I know, they were probably registering for it as they messaged me. However, the day didn't quite go as planned. Martha was called into an extra shift at work, meaning Gary would be home alone to meet Chris and his friend. Gary thought it would be alright if just a little awkward, as Martha was usually the social butterfly of the two. He told her he'd push through it though, and she went on her way. Gary later said he waited a long time for Chris to show up. They lived in a house-style apartment down the street from campus, basically a house split in half the vertical way, with a pretty open parking space. You couldn't miss it if anyone turned in. Chris was supposed to get there by noon, but he turned out to be an hour late. Gary happened to be looking out his window, just on the verge of calling and canceling, when an unfamiliar green Chevy pulled into the parking space. Gary was just relieved it didn't end up being a waste of time. He went out to greet them. Chris looked exactly like who he said he was, a young man in his mid-20s. He had short, cropped brown hair and a skinny frame, essentially an average father-to-be looking man. His friend was a slightly bigger guy that didn't seem to have a lot to say. They went over to the car and Chris seemed to like what he was seeing. Gary said he almost gushed about how his wife would love it, how it was perfect for the baby and all that. It was almost overwhelming. Anyway, they went for the test drive to seal the deal. Chris hopped in the driver's seat while Gary sat shotgun. Chris's friend took the seat behind Gary, and off they went with Gary directing. The plan was to take a couple of turns around some side streets, go through campus, then turn around, and take a parallel road back to their apartment. Everything seemed to be going fine at first. Chris was still talking Gary's ear off, and Gary was thinking the sale was all but final. The friend was still quietly idling in the back seat. Campus was pretty busy that day, so they got some good testing of the brakes due to jaywalkers. Chris didn't seem to mind. The problem came when they were supposed to start heading back. Gary directed Chris to the turn, but instead of taking it, he shot right past it and started to head out of town. He said it was because they wanted to do a little more driving, to see how it did on more remote roads. Gary felt a little weirded out, but he thought he might as well go along with it. Wasn't much he could do anyway. They continued to drive. The road became surrounded by thick walls of trees on either side and developed dangerous curves the further they went along. Chris had gone completely quiet at this point. Gary was really starting to sweat. He didn't know what was going on here exactly, but this was not what he'd signed up for. He told Chris he wanted to head back to make the sale final and clean up before Martha came home, but Chris ignored him. He started to reach for the door handle, but Chris pushed the driver's side button to lock it. Gary asked him what the hell he was doing, and that's when all hell broke loose. Chris's friend in the back seat lunged at him with something like a wire in his hand and tried to wrap it around Gary's neck. He saw black spots at the end of his vision as the wire started to dig into his skin and tighten around his throat. He remembered flailing his hands back at the guy, slapping, scratching, punching, anything to get himself free, but it was no use. He couldn't get a breath in. His entire face felt hot, and he could hear pounding in his ears. His eyes started to roll back in his head. He could vaguely hear Chris shouting something like, "Stop, you're gonna kill him, dude!" That's when Gary blacked out. He doesn't know how or why, but against all odds, Chris's accomplice stopped and he somehow survived. He woke up lying on the side of the road somewhere outside of town. He was filthy and covered in mud. It was the late afternoon and raining, so he must have been out for quite a while. He said he sat up eventually and looked around. He was surrounded by trees with no civilization in sight. Chris and the car were both gone. His neck throbbed and ached whenever something brushed up against it. He didn't know how far he was from town, so on stiff and sore legs he got up and started walking. Thankfully, he was going in the right direction and soon saw the towering campus buildings in the distance. He said he almost cried and laughed at the same time when he saw it. Martha was frantic when he got home. He left his phone and wallet on the counter and didn't leave a note, so she didn't know where he possibly could have gone. When he told her what happened with Chris, she just collapsed and sobbed into his chest for a while. Though they did make a police report, they eventually just said screw Chris and screw the car when nothing came up. They and I guessed that carjacking them had been the plan all along. It worked out better for them to get Gary alone and vulnerable. I'm not sure why the friend was so violent about it, but we concluded it was better not to question it. Long story short, my friends don't sell anything on Craigslist or online without a valid ID anymore. When I was a teenager, I dated a guy a couple of years older than me. We'll call him N. He was always exceptionally sweet and would tell me how I deserved the entire world. We never really broke up. He just moved away, and it was agreed that we wouldn't date anymore. Somehow, though, we would always end up connecting back with each other no matter what happened. Then, when I was 17, he went to jail for stabbing his stepdad. We hadn't seen each other in almost a year at that point. Afterwards, he would never really talk about it in detail, but he explained that he saw no choice in the matter at the time. His stepdad even went to his court hearings and stated that he was not to blame. He'd made the mistake of cornering him in a violent rage. When he got out of jail, though, he seemed to be a very different person. He was much more mature. He got a well-paying job right away, discovered his love of cooking, and became clean, organized, and well-read. He looked me up the first day he got back to town, and we slowly started redeveloping our friendship and eventually started casually dating. He began staying at my home on weekends, and then, after a few months, he needed a place to stay for a month and a half. Honestly, things seemed to be going really good. We were talking about maybe moving in together. He would hint at the idea of proposing even. Then one day he started drinking and became unsettling and weird. Almost immediately after he started drinking, he began lying, and I started to get the big heebie-jeebies. He would always say he was leaving for work, but then an hour later his coworker would come to the door and ask where he was. When I would ask him about it, instead of calmly explaining that he was at his mom's on the way to work or something, he would storm off and ignore me for days. I immediately ended the relationship after one of these incidents, telling him he could stay at his mom's place until he was ready to move into his own. A friend of mine came over to my house and helped me neatly pack up all his stuff. We dropped it off at his mom's place for him. I can't exactly tell you why, but we also decided to put chain locks on the door and had a key to, because even though he had given my key back, I had this completely unfounded by evidence suspicion that maybe he'd made a copy without telling me. Sure enough, that night N came to my door without calling and without knocking and tried to let himself in. I had rested my skateboard against the door, so when it opened I heard the crash. I heard him cuss under his breath and leave immediately. The next day, I came home from walking my dog with a male friend who I had been friends with my entire life and would often hang out with the both of us. There was a picture I had painted for N on the front porch of my house with blood splattered all over it. I asked my friend what I should do. He was honestly kind of horrified. It was too big to fit in the garbage can, and I didn't want this blood-covered painting just sitting around my house. Later that night, we ended up burning it in the outdoor fireplace. A few days later, N called me up and asked me if he could come over later and talk. I said that was fine, and he told me he would be over around 7 p.m. or so. At 8:30 though, he hadn't called or shown up at all. I was sitting on my computer when I got a call from my aunt who had a police scanner. Anne had apparently broken into a woman's home with a gun, and she had shot her own shotgun at him. Police eventually caught him running in the direction of my home. He went back to jail, but only for about 6 months, since they couldn't find the gun he had, and because the woman whose house he broken into didn't want to cooperate with the police. He ended up getting a very light charge. Around this time, I had started dating someone else. We'll call him S. The very first time we were out around town together, N saw us and came over. He ripped his shirt off in the middle of the street, challenging S to a fight. S just responded by kind of chuckling in discomfort. We got back into the car and left. This became a semi-regular occurrence. One night, we were cuddled up in my living room watching TV when we heard something hit the patio window really loudly. We went and looked around, expecting there to be a bird or something, but we couldn't find anything outside. The next day, after S had left, I went outside onto the small patio, and in the light of day, I could see what we'd missed the night before. It was a bullet for a hunting rifle. It looked like someone had thrown it at the window from over the fence. We ended up moving away, and I married S. N actually even randomly showed up once when we were meeting up with an all-around mutual friend. It was pretty weird, but it was also somewhat coincidental, so I just kind of shrugged it off. A while later, N went back to jail for breaking into another woman's home. He was released after a certain period of time. Almost immediately after his release, though, he was all over national news for trying to kidnap multiple children, going as far as to take one child and choke them until the father by coincidence found them and was able to fight him off. The boy survived but was unconscious for quite a while. Fortunately, he took no brain damage, but he was pretty shaken and likely will be for life. After N was incarcerated for that, he was arrested right after his release for the murder of a woman in the town we had grown up in. He had done it several years earlier. They had only discovered her remains whilst he was in jail. Details were never publicly released because the trial is still ongoing. The rumor is he broke into her house, having been casual acquaintances with her, and killed her, then moved her body to a small forested area on a mutual friend's parents' property. He also allegedly killed his cellmate while he was in jail. He was found not guilty though because the jail mishandled a bunch of the evidence and the prison guards all mixed up their stories a bit. The case couldn't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. His cellmate was just a poor young kid, barely 19, and only in jail for a big theft. Of course you should go to jail for stealing, but that's not a death sentence. While he's been in jail, he's apparently attacked multiple female prison guards by choking them. There were rumors around the town that some of the other missing people were also his doing. There were a bunch more true stories about women catching him trying to break into their homes. They never made it to court, though, because they couldn't prove who it was that was doing this at the time. The police had no one to look into. They only realized it was N when he became infamous for this sort of thing. I often think about the fact that I intimately knew this person, and sometimes I feel guilty for not having seen the signs. Other times, I feel creeped out that I could have been a victim of his. I feel like somehow I should have known I was living with a potential serial killer. Before he started drinking, though, he was truly a stand-up guy that had made some bad decisions and was doing his best to make a decent life for himself. Up until very recently, I never spoke about him or even acknowledged I used to know him. Obviously, my husband knows, but he knows it makes me uncomfortable to talk about, so we don't really discuss it. Almost a year ago, I, 24 and male, was fresh out of college. I had just moved into an apartment with my middle school bestie, 23 and female, and her fiancé, 25 and male. This was after a long period of not having seen her in person. My bestie and I had a long and great relationship with few rocky periods. I didn't really know the fiancé that well, but I had met him a couple of times. He came off as occasionally kind of rude and loud, but mostly a very nice guy. I let a lot of little annoying behavior slide though, because she was so in love with him. Really, all I wanted was to spend some time with my best friend. Over the course of a few months, I slowly discovered though that she was trapped in an abusive relationship, with the most classic example of a malignant narcissist imaginable. Their fights, really just him screaming at her while she cried, escalated to the point where he was completely trashing the apartment, breaking her phone and laptop, hiding her car keys, blocking the door, and grabbing her so hard she had bruises. All the while hurling the worst insults he could fathom at the top of his lungs for hours. This man was about a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier than me, so there was nothing I could really do other than give her a ride somewhere else away from him until the next day. He didn't like it whenever I did that. Once it reached the point of physical harm against her though, I put my foot down anyway and demanded he move out or I would call the police. He was not technically signed on to the lease, so I could kick him out at any time. He begged me for time to find a new place. He was extremely drunk and high the night he hurt her, and promised to stay sober until he moved away. Not wanting to escalate things, I agreed on the condition nothing like that ever happened again. My friend and her fiancé broke up soon after. 3 weeks passed by and everything was going pretty great. Ex-fiancé had found a new place and was in training for a new job. While still loud and inconsiderate, he hadn't really caused any problems so far. I get ready for bed early. I had an important meeting early the next day. I put on some comfy pajamas usually and lock my door before I change, out of habit. My bestie was out working, and it was just me upstairs in bed. The ex-fiancé was downstairs yelling on the phone about something. I tuned him out and tried to go to sleep. He was going to be moving out next week anyway. My chest rattled though from the booming footfalls coming up the stairs to my room, which woke me up from my sleep. My eyes snapped open to see my bedroom doorknob rattling back and forth. Locked. He let out a yell of pure malice and banged on my door. He screamed my name. The words were so slurred he sounded like he was trying to impersonate a lizard man. The hinges weren't looking so good. We lived in a crappy, cheap apartment with thin doors. I had to do something before he broke the door open, right? I said the only thing I could think of in that moment. What the fuck? Suddenly, the banging and screaming stopped, and the doorknob fell still. After a terrifying moment of silence, he said as flatly as possible, "Open the door, bud. Just come and open the door." I still laugh about that one. Like, after all that, I just walk over and open up for him. Instead, I grabbed my essentials and jumped out the window. I was on the second floor, but we also lived on a hilly slope, so the fall wasn't quite that high. I still managed to fall wrong though and hurt my ankle. I hobbled away as quickly as I could to my car and peeled out of there. I immediately called up my best friend and warned her not to return home. We made plans for her to stay with a friend after she got off work. I made it to the friend's house and passed out for a few hours. I woke up to a call from my bestie. He'd traveled all the way to her workplace with a knife and broken in. He assaulted her and held the knife up to her special needs client's throat, said he'd kill him right in front of her. Thank God a coworker overheard everything from another room and was able to call the police in time for everyone to come out alive. My bestie also said he was on the phone with her while he was banging on the door. He said his goal for the night was to kill me and make her listen. I was totally alone in the apartment with him, sleeping upstairs in my bed. If I hadn't locked my door that night, would I even still be alive? If I had left my car keys downstairs, would I have been able to get away? When I returned to my apartment the next morning, my bedroom door had been completely kicked in. My belongings were scattered everywhere, and the large butcher knives were missing from the kitchen, instead sitting in the corner of the hallway to my room. My first job was at McDonald's. This building was attached to a gas station and located just off a busy highway. I was 14 and had all kinds of bad luck at this age. I started a 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. This early, the store was usually empty, so only 3 people, myself included, were in the restaurant. The manager, who was in the back, and the cook, who was also in the back. I, the cashier, was up front. I was wiping down the counter when a man who looked to be in his mid-30s or early 40s came in. He didn't order anything though. Instead, he went straight to the restrooms, which were in the restaurant area just around the corner from my cash. Many truckers and travelers would come in simply to use the washrooms and leave, so this was not too uncommon an occurrence. I didn't really think much of it. After the man finished, though, he walked up to the counter and said this. Excuse me, I was just in the washroom and one of the toilets is overflowing. I immediately came around the counter and let him lead me toward the restroom. Suddenly, though, I got this terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and stopped dead in my tracks. I became very aware that no one was in the restaurant area, and the only other 2 people in the store were in the back. They would not be able to hear me if I went into the restroom. The man had the restroom door propped open and realized I had paused. "Come on in, I'll show ya." It came off innocently enough, but something was not sitting well with me. I smiled at him and said, "One moment, I'll get my manager." I started making my way back to the counter. "Come on, it'll only take a minute," he called out behind me. I met my manager in the back still and explained to him that a man was complaining about an overflowing toilet. My manager went to check it out, and I followed closely behind him. When we turned the corner, though, the man was gone. We entered the restroom, and no such toilet was overflowing. We exchanged a look and never brought it up again. To this day, I feel like some divine intervention must have given me the wisdom to know not to follow that man into the restroom. The whole situation only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like forever. I was young and trusting, and this man could have done God knows what. and I wouldn't have been heard. He could have left and got away with whatever he had planned and hit the highway right away. I never did see the man again after. Yesterday, while I, 23 and female, was on my way to work, a random man suddenly approached me and asked for my mobile number. I told him no, of course, and started to walk away, but he tried to argue with me and started walking after me. The conversation just went in a circle numerous times. When we arrived at the train station, he finally seemed to get my very oh-so-subtle hint that I did not want to talk to him, and so finally he left. I thought that would be the end of our interaction, and went more or less on my own merry way. Today, though, he turned up once again, a different time at the same train station. He stopped me while I was on my way back from work, initially blocking the entire path with his bike and asking for my number again. I told him no and tried to go around him. Of course, he followed me. Great. Anytime I told him I had no interest on getting to know him, he started rambling on and on about how he sensed all the love oozing off me, and he just knew I would feel the same. At least, if I only gave him a chance. For some inexplicable reason, that logic didn't convince me at all. When we got to the corner of the street I lived at, I stopped in place. I definitely was not going to let this stranger follow me all the way to my home. He noticed I'd stopped and told me, "Oh, don't worry, you can go home. I'll just come with you." He said this as if it were totally normal for someone to just invite themselves into another person's home, not even knowing each other's names or anything. Again, I told him that was not going to happen. Getting louder and far angrier at this point, he said okay and made like he was turning around to leave, or so I thought. As soon as I started approaching my home again, he suddenly rode his bike right up next to me. He began panting and begging me, giving me his sensing love shtick. So there I am standing there, going back and forth with this man, with him urging for me to just go home so he could follow me. It was only after I'd threatened him numerous times with the police and finally pulled out my phone that he did then leave. Whether it's for good or only for today, I guess we'll see. Either way, I asked my flatmate to come and walk back home with me. We took a detour just to be safe, and now I kinda just need to get this whole thing out my mind. I wanted to share this story so it will serve as a reminder to always follow your gut. Don't ever assume that just because you're in your own home and you get a strange feeling that you're only being paranoid. I'll give you an example right here. Several months ago, right as autumn was beginning and the days were becoming shorter, I was home alone at the house I shared with my roommate. Seasonal depression was sinking in, so I decided to just stay inside and have myself a lazy evening. I was on the couch flipping through Netflix when I got this overwhelming sensation that something was not quite right. It wasn't just a feeling of guilt or doubt or something because I wasn't being productive. It actually felt as if the whole world around me had come out of perfect alignment, like something was out of place. You know, the feeling you get while you're driving and one of your tires starts subtly deflating. I was unable to shake this feeling. I stood up and shut off the TV. I headed upstairs, not turning off any lights on the ground floor. Once upstairs, I turned on the hall light and entered the bathroom. I didn't feel like I was being watched necessarily, but I did feel this sense of invasion. I don't know how else to describe it. I got some music playing on my phone and decided I was going to take a hot shower. I was determined to distract myself and shake off this strange feeling. If I had any pets, I would have looked to see how they were acting, but I didn't, so I could only go off of how I felt. I chose to ignore that feeling of unrest. Before I was even done taking all my clothes off, though, I thought I could hear movement from downstairs. I muted my phone for a moment, but the noise didn't come again. I figured I was either hearing things or my roommate had returned home a little bit early and was downstairs. I didn't think for even a moment that some stranger might have entered my house. That's the type of thing that only ever happened to other people. I forced myself not to think like that. I knew that all my doors were locked and I lived in a safe neighborhood. That's what I kept telling myself, at least. I turned the shower on and finished getting undressed. I got inside and stayed in the shower longer than I needed to. Being in there did help, but it didn't completely calm my nerves down. As soon as I turned off the water, that feeling was back in full force. I suddenly felt like I needed to be very quiet. I stepped carefully out of the shower and turned off my phone. It was then that I noticed that underneath the crack of the door, there was the shadow of someone standing just outside. The only thing standing between me and that person was an old wooden door and a latch lock that anyone could break if they threw even a fraction of their weight into it hard enough. I stared down at the shadow. Finally, I allowed myself to panic. Had it been my roommate or a family member with a spare key, it would not just be standing still outside the door. Surely they would knock and announce themselves if they needed something. I didn't even hear anyone breathing. A scenario flashed through my head of me not having noticed that shadow, throwing open the door in an oblivious fashion, and having a knife driven into my heart as I fell into the arms of a masked stranger. I slowly put on my shorts and my shirt and stared at that shadow under the door, still unmoving. After another moment, I made a decision. I slowly began to open the bathroom window. I flushed the toilet, then lifted up the wooden frame of the window. I swung my legs out of it. As I was sliding out fully onto the roof, my head knocked against the blinds and made them rattle. I swear in that split second, my heart stopped in place. I could hear movement starting outside the door. I looked out the window right as I heard the door crash open behind me. I slid across the roof and immediately let myself fall to the cold ground. I rolled and picked myself up and sprinted across my lawn, not even bothering to look back and see if they were chasing me. I ran back to my neighbor's house and pounded on their back door until they let me in. I called the police from my phone after they locked the door behind me. When the police got there, they searched my home and discovered that it was empty. Inside every single room, though, they found evidence of footprints and signs that someone had been rummaging around through my things. The intruder had been wandering from room to room while I was in the shower. Outside the living room window, they discovered very specific DNA that indicated he was watching me as I was laying down on the couch. This guy had patiently waited for me to leave the ground floor before entering the home through the back door. He then waited for me outside the bathroom when he could have easily broken in and grabbed me. There were 1,000 things that could have gone wrong that night. I could have ignored my gut feeling the second time. The intruder could have decided to be less patient. I could have shut the lights off behind me so there was no shadow at all. He could have waited down the hall instead of right outside the door. I really believe I had a 1 in 100 chance of getting out of there alive, and I somehow rolled the dice and beat the odds. I should be dead. I have no idea who that guy was or why he chose my home. I do know one thing for certain, though. I will never doubt my gut feelings again. Take this to heart, everyone listening, and try to always be aware of your surroundings. Play it safe even if it feels silly, and never ignore your gut instincts.